Thanks for tuning in to today's rescheduled event with Jeffrey Toobin and Scott Turow, two of our nation's most influential and fun legal writers. I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Bloc, now in our 25th season. Jeffrey Toobin's new book, True Crimes and Misdemeanors, right here, the investigation of Donald Trump, proves that sometimes you really do want to know how the sausage is made. Jeffrey knows how to tell a story. It's the characters who drive this drama, even when the action or inaction of both sides of the Mueller investigation and impeachment trial itself make this book such a page turner, less than 80 days before the election. The drama of this administration is unprecedented. That's a word that keeps coming up in this book, as Toobin illustrates again and again. As you read it, you can hear Jeffrey's indignation and condemnation for some individuals, and also intense admiration for others. True Crimes and Misdemeanors is really the definitive text on the last 4 years in one handy volume. You can't make this stuff up. Well, unless you're Scott Turow. Turow writes courtroom dramas, some of which have become classics. The stories are so thrilling and full of action that I wonder why members of my family, full of great attorneys, never experience such existential reckoning as Scott's characters do. Scott has also been a staunch advocate for criminal justice reform and has advocated against the death penalty to great success. His latest novel, The Last Trial, was just released, and I love it. Visit writersblockpresents.com to find the link to Chevalier's bookstore. They have signed copies of True Crimes and Misdemeanors, and I urge you to buy your copy now. And while you're on the website, if you like Writer's Block and what we're doing, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution to keep these important programs going. I'm so delighted to present Jeffrey Toobin and Scott Turow.
Thank you, Andrea. So we were scheduled for your pub date, which was August 4th, and the power went out on the East Coast, and we couldn't do this.
That's true. But
yeah,
here we are.
We got power again.
But
I didn't realize how privileged I was, because I was going to get the first crack at you as an interlocutor. And since then, you have been everywhere. Literally, when I turn on my TV, when the car radio, Chris Hayes, Fresh Air, CNN yesterday with Wolf Blitzer talking about the book. It got to the point that I was surprised when our 2.5-year-old granddaughter spoke and your voice didn't come out. You were that omnipresent. And the book has flown onto the New York Times bestseller list. And for those of us who've read it, that is no surprise. The narrative rips along like a cigar boat. The legal issues get the usual deft explanation, but not unexpectedly, the most satisfying thing is the level of reporting. And I thought I was a Mueller investigation junkie. You know, you and I would exchange occasional emails, tossing legal theories around, and it's despite how steeped in all of it I thought I was. The most engaging thing to me, besides the pace of the narrative, were the details that I didn't know and hadn't learned anywhere else. The fact that Robert Mueller lost his telephone, which you reveal in the very first paragraph, when he went to the White House the day he was interviewed to return to the FBI. A more tasty detail is that Roger Stone was dismissed from the Dole presidential campaign because he posted an ad complete with pictures on a swingers website of his wife and himself. I didn't know that Bill Barr...
As one does.
Yeah, I guess. I didn't know that Bill Barr began his legal career at the CIA. I didn't know that Trump played golf with Andrew Giuliani, Rudy's son, and that Trump actually talked Andrew into resuming his relationship with his father, Rudy, after the son was somewhat put out when Rudy Giuliani announced at a press conference that he was leaving his wife, a fact that he had not shared with Andrew's mother. And then the book goes on and does a great job of recounting the entire Ukraine episode. And what is most impressive to me is the degree to which it connects the two things. That is the Mueller investigation, the Burisma fiasco. As you point out, there are many of the same characters, Giuliani, Manafort, and of course at the center, the same willful, myopic, deceitful human being. And assuming and hoping that the most lasting legacy of the Trump administration is its assault on democratic institutions, then this book will probably be the official account of how some of the most celebrated episodes occurred. But since you've been out and about, and I'm not the first person to ask you questions, I wanted to take advantage of that, although I do want to come back to the book, to ask you about some things that you may not be asked about as often. I think most people who see you on TV or read what you write in the New Yorker know you started out as a lawyer, but in point of fact, you know, you had an all-star legal pedigree. You were a member of the Harvard Law Review, you had a federal court clerkship, you worked as an assistant U.S. attorney in Brooklyn, you were an associate counsel in the independent counsel investigation of Iran-Contra, but you were also working simultaneously in journalism. You'd written for the Harvard Crimson while you were an undergraduate. You freelanced for the New Republic while you were in law school. And both your parents, of course, were significant figures in broadcast news. So here's the question. Did you always plan to be a journalist? Was your dalliance with the law just that, a kind of side trip? How serious were you about a legal career?
In the best political tradition, I am not going to answer the question, at least right away. And just say how delighted I am to be here to start. Thank you to Andrea. Thank you for making us a part of Writer's Bloc. Both Scott and I have been part of Writer's Bloc as both questioners and as guests several times. It is a wonderful institution. I'm grateful to be a part of it, albeit long distance. It's much more fun to be in LA. But this is what this is our lives today. And also, I just want to say, I mean, Scott and I, as I suspect you will all hear over the course of this hour, that we are old friends, but just how much I admire Scott Turow as a writer and as a human being. I mean, Scott writes great books. You know, Scott is burdened with like enormous great success, which is, I admit, a first world problem, but I think sometimes leads people to not recognize just what a fine novelist Scott is and just how good his sentences are, how good the stories are. And it's just a treat and an honor to be a part, to be talking to you in this kind of setting. Okay, now I'll answer.
Enough incense swinging. Let's back to my question.
Right. Did I always want to be a journalist or a lawyer? I want to be a lawyer. I mean, my parents, my mother, Marlene Sanders, was one of the pioneering television news correspondents among women, first network news woman in Vietnam, among many other firsts. My dad, Jeffrey Toobin, was one of the founding fathers of public broadcasting, Bill Moyer's producer for many years. And at the dinner table, they told me, don't be a journalist, like in an explicit way. They said, this is too mercurial, it's too uncertain, you're up, you're down, have a stable career, go to law school, and be involved in public life, maybe be involved in politics, government. And I listened to that advice, unlike some parental advice. And I always thought of myself that way. I think to an embarrassing degree, I showed up in college like with sort of law school blinders on. But I also, had this journalism, I think, gene, it probably comes down to. And so, as you pointed out, I did high school journalism, I did college journalism, I freelanced. when I was in law school, and I found the idea of telling stories and reporting stories. It just I sometimes think of it as sort of coming into my genetic destiny. The real turning point in my career was really what led to our meeting, Scott. Was I wrote a book about my experience on the Lawrence Walsh Iran-Contra investigation, which now is approximately 700 years ago, but some people may have heard of it. And Scott reviewed it for the LA Times, and the book was controversial because there were people, including my boss Lawrence Walsh, and including Scott Turow, who thought, maybe some young punk kid should not have violated the sanctity of an investigation, and we're done a book about it. And the review you wrote was extremely complimentary about my storytelling and my writing, but it was also pretty not extremely fond of the idea of writing a book like that. And I think that review, among other things in my life, sort of contributed to the idea that at some point you have to pick and you do one or the other. And again, as my dad used to say, to make a long story unbearable, when I was at the sort of after 3 years at the U.S. Attorney's Office, Tina Brown was hired as editor of the New Yorker. My friend David Remnick, who was just a lowly staff writer at that point, said, she's hiring people. She doesn't know a lot of people. Maybe you should, fax in some clips. You remember faxes. Anyway, I got hired almost instantly as a talk of the town writer in 1993. And in 1994, the O.J. Simpson case happened, which I covered, and I, broke some big stories and got a book contract, started appearing on TV. That was really, what sealed the deal for me to be a journalist. But if you had asked me as a kid, what was I really wanting to do? It was very much law, not writing and journalism.
One of the things I love about being older is that I talk to people and we no longer remember things the same way. So my memory of this review of opening arguments is that I said nothing about the controversy, or very little. And then, and I just talked about what a talented writer you were and what a really outstanding book it was. Then I wrote you a letter and said, I think you may regret this. What?
Now this is coming back to me. I wrote you a letter thanking you for the review.
Right.
And you responded
right.
with that letter. That's exactly right. Yes.
And we had friends in common by then, which is pretty much what you would expect in the U.S. Attorney's Office networks around the country. But okay, so we have you as a journalist, and we actually met face to face. You came to Chicago to work on a story that appeared in the New Yorker, and you interviewed me at lunch. And
that's when we first met.
That's when we first met face to face. But one of the things I've never really talked about with you is the way you work. I know while you were ostensibly working on this book that you were very frustrated. Within the Mueller office, nobody was talking. Right. You had a journalist's wrath about the fact that no one would talk on double deep secret, down low basis. And yet here is this book, incredibly well researched and full of the kinds of details I mentioned before. So, and one of the things that's deeply impressive to me, frankly, is just the speed with which you write. And how do the writing and the reporting meld?
Well, that you are certainly right about the frustration of the experience, although it was tinged with a kind of admiration for how the Mueller office was so completely leak free to me or to anyone
Your,
else.
your complaints were all ironic, I should
Right.
add.
But,
You knew
but you know, and you know, as I write in the book, you know, Mueller himself was appalled by several aspects of the Kenneth Starr investigation. One was all the leaks that came out of the office, and two, how long the investigation took, how many years Starr was the independent counsel, both of which he may have overcorrected for. But just in terms of reporting and writing, I mean, what I did was, I mean, I agreed with my editors at my editor, Bill Thomas at Doubleday, to write a book about the Mueller investigation shortly after you know, Mueller was appointed in May of 2017. You know, I quickly realized that I wasn't going to get any Mueller access. You know, I guess I had the confidence that I would get it eventually. But when you have a big sprawling investigation like this, you do have people who interact with the office. You have defense attorneys, you have witnesses, you have people who knew the protagonists in earlier phases of life. So there are people you can talk to. But I was nervous and about whether I would get the access, because, you know, one of the things that I am always conscious of, you know, I've written several books, not all my books, but several books about sort of big high profile subjects like, you know, the Clinton-Lewinsky investigation, like OJ, where people are, you know, following it. Now, the good news about that is they're sort of already interested in the story. But I feel as a writer, I have to give them something that they don't know. And that's very important to me. And that's where the reporting comes in. You know, with the writing, we haven't talked about this a lot, but one of the things I remember you saying to me once, I mean, you are someone who has, you know, written, like, you have a pattern every 3 years? 3
as
years.
I get older, I'm trying to shorten it. But anyway, 3 years at the moment.
A novel every 3 years. And one of the things you once said to me is, you know, writers have, you know, there is this sort of romance about, you know, writers being, you know, passionate and, you know, waiting for inspiration. But if you look at the writers who are successful and productive, they tend to be workers. I mean, they tend to be people who are disciplined and have some sort of system. Now, I have a particularly simple-minded system. I don't know if we've ever discussed this, but when I am writing a book, this doesn't apply when I am reporting a book, and it doesn't apply to my New Yorker work. But when I am actually at the writing stage of a book, I commit to myself that I will write 5 double-spaced pages a day, 1,250 words or more. Sometimes I, you know, get up to 6 or rarely 7, but and it's funny, you know, I've been writing books for a long time, and my kids who are now grown up, when they were little, you know, they didn't follow this, but they're like, how many pages, Daddy? Did you, you know, because they knew this was my commitment, and I've done it with all 8 books that I've written. And I find that for whatever reason, 1,250 words is an amount that allows me to sort of edit the chapter I'm working on, continue doing some reporting, and advance 5 pages a day. And, you know, 5 pages a day, 25 pages a week. I only do it 5 days a week. I don't do it 7 days a week. And 100 pages a month. It adds up, and you get a book in about 6 to 8 months. And
Wow.
that's how I do it. And it's sort of simple-minded, but, you know, it's worked for me.
So, but you're not. Are you on leave from the magazine during that period?
Yes. I'm not on leave from CNN,
Yeah,
but
no.
I cannot write a book and write New Yorker pieces at the same time. And fortunately, David Remnick, who's been the editor of most of my tenure at the New Yorker, has been generous about book leaves. Now, of course, you know, the New Yorker is an integrated content machine, and I continue. I wrote shorter pieces for the website while I was on book leave, but sort of the long traditional New Yorker pieces I could not write while I was writing a book. It's just too much.
Yeah, I wasn't sure how much you had accepted that advice, which I give frequently when asked about, you know, a writer is a profession and you got to put your rear end in the chair every day. Because
you know, it's funny, whenever I think of that piece of advice, I think of sort of the prototypical sort of dissolute writer, Truman Capote. And what do we know about Truman Capote? He never finished a book after In Cold Blood, which, I think it shows you, like, that may be a glamorous life, and maybe you can make a living if you're Truman Capote, but you don't have much to show for it at the end.
Yeah, well, and some people say he didn't write In Cold Blood, but that's another story. But because the way the book reads, it's almost like you were sitting there in your underwear and just, power driving through it in a month, because it's just got that tremendous narrative force. How much of what you,
I'm sorry,
how much of the 1,250 words do you edit, and when do you edit it?
Well, the way I work is I'm very focused on chapters. I'm not a big outliner, but I do sort of have an idea about each chapter. And each chapter tends to be, in the 4,000 or 5,000 word range. And so when I edit, let's say I'm starting a chapter, I'll write the first 1,250 words. Then I will start the next day by editing those 1,250 words and then adding 1,250 more. On the third day, I go back to the beginning and do the whole, the 2,500 words. And so by the time I've written a 4,000 or 5,000 word chapter, I will have edited it 4 or 5 times already. And I don't know if readers are, my own sense as a reader is, when I like to finish a chapter, but I also want to be left with some reason to continue reading the book. So I always try to end a chapter in a way that, raises something that you'll say, oh, well, I want to keep going. But this book was so, this was the hardest book I've ever written, in part because of the access issues, but also because I didn't know what the story was. I agreed to write this book in May of 2017. I didn't know what Mueller was going to find. And I certainly didn't know there was going to be this whole Ukraine Congress impeachment chapter. And so in that respect, and of course, for commercial reasons, I both my editor at Doubleday and I thought this book has to come out, basically in the summer of 2020. So, there just was a lot of time pressure, a lot of reporting pressure. And, the story was moving through much of the tenure. I feel very grateful that though the Senate trial was a deeply unsatisfying experience as a citizen and as an observer, at least it ended in February, which, gave me time to write a real book. I would have hated to have to end the book before the Senate trial or something like that. But those were the kind of issues I was worrying about throughout the time I was, working on the book.
Okay, so I'll move away from process now, although my next question is sort of in between, because you made a decision as a journalist that I want you to expand on for the people who are listening. Your descriptions of Donald Trump are unsparing and unapologetic about the fact that they're unsparing. You say that early in Trump's term, the FBI leadership knew about Trump's, quote, reputed temper, impatience, lack of intellectual curiosity, but they had no idea of the magnitude of his flaws, of his narcissism, sociopathy, and ignorance. Trump's only concern was his feral self-interest. His only belief was that those around him existed to serve him. You describe Trump's tweets as exhibiting racism and misogyny, mindless belligerence, norm-shattering impropriety, and constant lies. And
but other than that, they were kind of good.
Right. So, and obviously, Trump as a subject is a very challenging one for anybody in a profession that values objectivity. And this is true of your comments often when you're on the air. You just basically lay it on the line about But I wonder what your thinking has been about that.
Well, this is something that I mean, I don't mean to make light of it. I mean, it is something that I have given. I gave a lot of thought to in the book, and I've given it a lot of thought, in my CNN work. I mean, one of the things I enjoy as a journalist is complexity of character. People who are neither all good nor all bad, who don't, who struggle with human emotions, and sometimes, come out in a way I admire, sometimes not. I mean, I think about people like James Comey, like Rod Rosenstein, like Mueller himself, all of whom are people, highly intelligent people, who in my portrayal are complicated. And I embrace that. I find that both realistic and interesting, both as a reader and as a journalist. And I have written about, controversies before. Kenneth Starr, I think, is, fits that description, as does Bill Clinton. I've never covered anyone like Donald Trump. I've never met anyone like Donald Trump. I mean, it's one of the lines, I didn't quote myself, one of the reasons I begin the book the way I do, with the one and only meeting between Mueller and Trump, this meeting on May 16th, 2016, about the FBI directorship in the Oval Office. I believe I say, to describe the two of them challenges the conventions of journalistic balance, because you're supposed to say, well, on the one hand, he was this, on the other hand, he was that. I can't figure out the other hand with Donald Trump. I mean, the only thing I see are the qualities that you just read. And, this is a bit of a tangent, but, one of the conventions that Trump led to a change in at CNN was that, the chyrons at the bottom of the screen, CNN has a long tradition of journalistic balance, as I put it. And, the conventions at CNN had always been to say, well, some say X and some say Y, or not X. But during the 2016 campaign, CNN started saying Trump says falsely X, Y, and Z, just like false, because, some things are just false. And later, during his presidency, we started using the word lie. And, I come out of a journalistic tradition where that balance is the custom. But I'm not going to make up balance where it doesn't exist. I'm not going to pretend there are two sides of the story when he says, he actually won the 2016 election because there were 3 million votes that weren't counted, or that he set a record at the attendance in the at the inauguration. So, I mean, I felt like to portray him any other way was not balance, it was dishonesty, and I didn't want to do it.
So it would disserve the truth. Okay. So you can't write a book if it can all be reduced to a headline, but I still want to go toward the headline, as it were, of this book. And I'll do it by presenting a true-false question. If one defines a successful grand jury investigation as a disciplined inquiry that uncovers all legally available evidence to reliably determine whether there is sufficient competent proof to charge anyone with a crime, then the Mueller investigation was a success. True or false?
Well, Counselor, I guess I would say mostly true. I admire I admire Mueller. I admire virtually all of the prosecutors on his staff. I think all of them. They are fine journalists. They're not journalists. They are fine lawyers. They are fine prosecutors. I think they conducted themselves admirably under incredibly difficult circumstances. I think they uncovered a tremendous amount of information that was was important for the American people to know. I think they brought some very important cases and won them against Michael Flynn, against Paul Manafort, against Roger Stone, against George Papadopoulos, Rick Gates. I think there were two big holes in the investigation, and there were two big flaws. I don't believe they were moral flaws. I don't believe they were flaws that came out of avarice or greed or some bad, quality. But I think they were mistakes, and very consequential mistakes. And so that's why I am reluctant to answer your question in a true, a true false format.
Well, I was, teasing you a little bit because I read the book as saying, despite your earnest and admiring portrayal of Robert Mueller and his career, that his investigation basically was a failure. And the two reasons are, to give you the floor back,
the two reasons are his failure to issue a grand jury subpoena for Trump's testimony, oral testimony, and his failure to state in his final report that Trump was guilty, and that there were the evidence he had accumulated was sufficient to prove that Trump committed the crime of obstruction of justice several different times. And I think, the failure to subpoena Trump and the failure to state clearly his conclusions about obstruction of justice were really consequential failures. I think, Trump never had to really answer questions in a formal setting, other than, to sort of filibuster at press availabilities or press interviews. And, his failure to state the obstruction of justice conclusion was sort of a double failure, because it confused the public about what he really found, and it opened the door for William Barr, who has turned out to be a remorseless, Trump partisan, to actively mislead the public about what Trump did and didn't do. And so those are two big failures. But I don't want to give the impression that I think there was nothing that he didn't that Mueller and his team didn't accomplish anything, because I certainly don't believe that.
well, so let's follow out the logic of the first one, which was not issuing a grand jury subpoena to compel Donald Trump to testify. I think we can tell from recent history that he would have litigated that question.
Oh, I mean, that's not yes, certainly.
And
they knew that. The Trump lawyers said that from day one. Yeah.
And assuming that there were not some technical issue about how Mueller was appointed, which I'm sure they would have questioned. But assuming that was not case determinative, then we pretty much know from Trump versus Vance that Trump would have lost.
I think so. Especially if you believe that. I mean, given the way the case was litigated, Anthony Kennedy would have still been on the court, not Brett Kavanaugh. And I just think there would have been, if you look, and the precedent of the Nixon case about the Nixon tapes case, and the Clinton v. Jones case about the Paula Jones, where the court said President Clinton had to give a deposition in the Paula Jones sexual harassment civil lawsuit. I think Mueller would have won that case, but that you don't know for sure.
So why didn't he issue the subpoena?
Well, I mean, that's a big part of the book, and that's a saga that goes on over several months. Yeah, I think there were a variety of reasons. I think again, in the same way that people's greatest strengths are often their greatest weakness. Mueller is an institutionalist. He is someone who has dedicated his life to institutions, whether it's the Marine Corps or the Justice Department or the FBI. And, he was a subordinate of the FBI. He was not an independent counsel. He was not appointed under the same law as Kenneth Starr or Lawrence Walsh. He was part of the Justice Department, and he was he didn't want to get into a fight with Rod Rosenstein, who was his superior there, and Rosenstein never said no to Mueller, but Mueller was careful about asking him about what he wanted to do, and he wasn't sure Rosenstein was going to say yes to a grand jury subpoena. There was also good lawyering on the part of Trump's lawyers. As a former prosecutor and still a defense attorney, one of the things defense attorneys do is delay things and try to stretch things out so that inertia takes over and the clock starts to work against prosecutors. John Dowd, Trump's first lead lawyer, Jay Sekulow, who was the only lawyer who was with Trump for the duration, and then Rudy Giuliani for all his craziness, and there was a lot of craziness. They were smart about sort of not saying no to Mueller about an interview, but stretching out the controversy so long that by the time Mueller had to decide one way or another, it was so late that Mueller felt like he didn't want to extend the investigation for the time it would take to litigate a grand jury subpoena. And I thought that was a good piece of lawyering by the defense, none of which I think are sufficient to justify not issuing the subpoena. I think it was a flat out mistake, but that's how it.
As you explain it, he became Mueller, a prisoner of what he himself thought and what Rosenstein had impressed upon him, which was, don't be like Ken Starr and treat this job as a permanent position. Get in, get out. We don't want this going on forever. The more you have that attitude, the less able you are to litigate.
Well, that's although, I mean, this is where I think the problem, I mean, that's why the delay strategy works so well. But, as I write in the book, Mueller was appointed in May of 2017. In their negotiations, they had sort of a very tentative agreement for Trump to testify at Camp David in January of 2018. Relatively close to that date, John Dowd pulled the plug. That was the time Mueller could have issued a grand jury subpoena, because even then, he probably could have gotten it litigated by June, the end of the Supreme Court, June, July, the end of the Supreme Court term. He was only barely a year into his tenure. That, I think, the timing issue only worked against him because Mueller delayed so long and didn't let it and didn't seize the moment when he could have it, in my opinion.
So if you had asked me at the time, and I would have said, oh, Trump can never take 5. Given the norm defying behavior that has become routine from this president, it seems a virtual certainty that he never would have testified, and that he would have asserted his Fifth Amendment privilege, talking about hoax and Lisa Page and the dossier, and he's not going to cooperate in a phony investigation, and and despite the way he ridiculed other people for asserting their Fifth Amendment privilege, he wouldn't care.
And that's certainly possible, and I it's interesting. I have put that to the lawyers on both sides. Wouldn't he have just taken the Fifth anyway? So you never. And the defense lawyers, for what they, I don't know if it's hard to answer these hypotheticals. They say, look, they felt like the president of the United States, asserting his right against self-incrimination would have been too embarrassing and too damaging, and he would actually have answered questions. Again, I think also the timing is significant. January of 2018 was still very early in Trump's presidency. he's gotten much more reckless and much more outspoken and much more norm defying as time has passed. And the Donald Trump of 2017, I don't think would have said, well, I'm not funding the post office because that'll let the Democrats win the election. I mean, the norm shattering improprieties have come faster and furious and more furious in later in his presidency. But you're right. I do think it's certainly at least a possibility that he would have taken the fifth, but Mueller never forced the question on.
Right. So, and let's turn to the second of the failings, which is Mueller's reluctance to categorically state that the evidence was sufficient to support charges for obstruction of justice. Mueller, as you explain in the book, it makes sense, but maybe not to non-lawyers. Mueller thought that the Department of Justice policy, which is against indicting a sitting president, that he had to adhere to that if he said the president had committed a crime, that he would be denying Trump the public forum that other criminal defendants routinely get when the prosecutor says you committed a crime. They get a trial and the opportunity to defend himself. Trump wouldn't get that. So he didn't want to say out loud he committed a crime. That was his logic, as you explained.
I mean, that's a very accurate summation of Mueller's position. And by the way, I actually agree with the Justice Department policy. A lot of my liberal friends don't, but that I don't think under our constitutional system you can have a president of the United States sitting in court as a defendant. The other branches of government can function with people substituting for one another. You can't with the executive branch. There's only one president. But putting that aside, that is the policy. And Mueller, as an employee of the Department of Justice, felt duty bound to honor that policy. However, he kind of expanded that policy to a right not even to have the evidence the conclusions of the evidence spelled out against him, which I thought was an unnecessary additional benefit. Yes, Mueller couldn't have prosecuted him, but there was nothing in that policy that said he couldn't just say what the evidence showed and conclude what the evidence showed. And I thought it was just a weird sort of overthinking of a relatively straightforward problem, which is, what do you do when you can't indict somebody? Donald Trump does not exactly suffer from lack of access to abilities to defend himself. I mean, he certainly has plenty of access to the news media. Everybody listens to what he says. So the idea that this would have been some unfairness upon him, I think, is just was really overthinking. And I think it was really unfortunate, and it turned out to be really unfortunate because it opened the door for Barr's really, I thought, outrageous misuse of his role as the gatekeeper for the public disclosure of the report.
And misrepresentation of what Mueller had actually said, which is that the evidence doesn't exonerate the president.
Right, and again, to remember, if people will remember the chronology, Barr announced his conclusions misleadingly about the report in March of 2019, but the report itself was not released for a month, and that meant that the conventional wisdom that there was nothing there had a month to harden before the public had a chance to see the report. And the report itself, I think of the report as the Mueller report as sort of like Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, which was a book that was purchased a great deal but not read very much. And I think that's true for the Mueller report as well. So if all you knew of the Mueller report, as most people knew, was the what Bill Barr said about it and what the president said about it over and over again for a month before the report, it was, it was fatal to an accurate public understanding of what Mueller actually found.
So since I've got you, I'm going to ask my two favorite questions that were unanswered, one of which relates directly to what you just said. One reason Barr was able to get away with this malarkey was because he had standing behind him Rod Rosenstein, the assistant attorney general, or deputy assistant deputy attorney general, who had steadfastly defended Mueller throughout the investigation. It sort of deflected Trump's attacks. Was portrayed pretty much as the sort of Department of Justice lifer straight shooter that you'd want in that job. What is up with Rod Rosenstein?
Again, as I said earlier, one of the things I like about doing these projects is discovering that people are complicated and confusing and contradictory, and they do weird things. And one of my, I think, most revealing facts about Rod Rosenstein is that when Barack Obama was elected president, he replaced every George W. Bush U.S. attorney in the United States, as is customary for new presidents, except one, Rod Rosenstein. Rod Rosenstein was the only U.S. attorney in the country who kept in office between Bush and Obama. And that says to me that this guy, for all his sort of earnest Justice Department lifer demeanor and history, was a political survivor. He had enormous political survivor instincts. And, he's the guy who, the Trump White House gets him to write this memo about James Comey, and then unbeknownst to Rosenstein, they use it as the justification to fire Comey, even though Rosenstein had no intention that it would be used that way, and he was hugely embarrassed. But then he turns around and appoints Robert Mueller as special counsel, which was an act of, I think, considerable integrity and considerable courage, and then protects Mueller's investigation. But then when Barr is in charge, he, stands behind him during this. And Rosenstein says, well, I don't agree with all of Barr's rhetoric, but I didn't think there was a prosecutable case against the president. What can I tell you? People. I don't mean to, duck the final verdict, but Rosenstein's a complicated guy.
He's very enigmatic. I want to make sure I get to my other question that I never understood. Probably the most disappointing public capstone of the Mueller investigation was Robert Mueller's own appearance before Congress, where he was revealed to be hard of hearing, and which made him look like a doddering old man. And he is, as you put it, an old 74, or he was at the time an old 74. And what confused me, and just to interrupt myself, his appearance was so faltering that Trump reportedly turned off the TV after watching him for half an hour with the feeling, I'm completely in the clear now. Nobody's going to listen to this old fool. But my question is, how did the Democrats do this to themselves? Weren't they able to go have a face-to-face meeting with this man and see that he was not the stuff of TV stars? Or somebody on the staff say, sidling up to them and saying, I love him, but I don't think he's going to make a very good impression on TV, and you better think about this. What happened?
Well, there's a lot. There are a lot of levels there. First of all, I mean, from the Democrats in the House perspective, you had factions within the by then Democratic majority in the House of Representatives, and you had, remember, you're talking about the House Judiciary Committee for the most part, which is where all the firebrands are. It's, you know, the real liberals are on there, whether it's Jerry Nadler, the chairman, or you just go through the list. This is not where the moderates go, and they were enormously frustrated that their reading of the Mueller report compelled them to support impeachment. They wanted him out. Nancy Pelosi, on the other hand, I mean, so interesting. Pelosi is was often thought of as like this, wild-eyed San Francisco liberal. She was against impeachment till almost the bitter end, because she cares above all about preserving her majority in the House, and she didn't want to expose her, the freshman members who had won in Trump districts to difficult votes on impeachment that wasn't going to succeed in the Senate anyway. So there was tension within the House Democratic caucus about whether to go forward, and the only tool that Nadler and company felt they had after the release of the Mueller report was Mueller himself. That was the only thing they thought could break through the logjam. At the same time, Mueller himself was deeply unhappy about the idea of having to testify. Now, I don't want to give more access to his innermost thoughts than I am privy to, but he also is a very old school person. And as you know, Scott, there is this sort of old school tradition that prosecutors talk in court or not at all. And he did not want to have to extrapolate beyond his report. I think, and his staff was very protective of him. And in the really torturous long negotiations about his testimony, Mueller never spoke to the staff, never spoke to the members. He did it all through his subordinates. And they felt he was the only tool they had. And they didn't realize how diminished a figure he was. And I think the nation saw that on July 24th, 2019, in a kind of painful way. There was also sort of weird logistical problems. As I write in the book, there was this confusion about how many photographers were allowed in the well and for how long. And they stayed there the whole time, clicking away so that Mueller couldn't hear exactly what was going on. And, and as I say, he was an older 74. And, and in the, this is the kind of stuff that, you are always worried about the plausibility of your work. The next morning, July 25th, after Mueller, lays an egg, that's when Trump is emboldened to have his infamous conversation with President Zelensky of Ukraine and says, I want you to do us a favor, investigate Joe Biden or you're not getting your money for your defense. But, the proximity of those two events is not coincidental at all. This is what happens when bullies get emboldened, is they take things the next step.
All right, so this is probably going to be the last question, because I want to give Andrea a moment to come back on and, as she well should, flog your book again. Mueller's conclusion was that there was not evidence of direct coordination between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. Now, at first that seems somewhat startling, because you've got this email that says flatly that the Russian government wants to help Trump get elected. It goes to Jared Kushner, it goes to Donnie Jr., it goes to Manafort. They're all sitting in a meeting in Trump Tower. I think there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that Trump knew that was going to happen. So do you accept Mueller's conclusion. And on this one, I'll invite you to speculate.
No, I do. I do. Well, and I just, prosecutors deal with what they can prove, and there is nothing Mueller looked at harder than the question of whether there was collusion, which is not a legal term, but or any sort of unlawful conspiracy between Trump or his subordinates and the Russians in the 2016 campaign. One of the things that is just so amazing about what he did find, what Mueller did find, was the magnitude of the Russian effort to help Trump. And the idea that there are still some people out there who think it's unproven is just crazy. I mean, whether it was the Internet Research Agency, this nominally private company run by a Russian oligarch, close friend of Putin's, which used social media to help Trump get elected, but even more dramatically and much more consequentially, the efforts by the Russian military, which it's like part of the government, to hack into the DNC, to hack into John Podesta's emails, and then turn them over to WikiLeaks for to be weaponized against the against the Clinton campaign. It was an enormous undertaking. But the question is, what was the nexus with the Trump campaign? And there really was no proof that Mueller could find that Trump knew about this stuff in advance or made any sort of agreement. And as you know, a conspiracy takes an agreement and an act, and there was no proof that Trump did any of that. The irony is, Trump probably would have if he was given the opportunity, but there never was any evidence, any proof that he had that sort of access. He was delighted that it was being done, and he had no moral qualms about it. Everybody was seeing the video of him saying, WikiLeaks, I love WikiLeaks. But Roger Stone, talked about his contacts with WikiLeaks, but he never really had any. And,
more than that, if you have a direct line to Putin, you don't need to ask Roger Stone about WikiLeaks.
Right. And there just was no evidence that Trump did have a direct line to Putin. Now, one of the things Mueller did not do, and here I am somewhat more sympathetic, and I don't want to start in a whole tangent here, but he did not look at the tax returns. He did not look at Trump's financial records. So the question of Trump's financial relationship with Russia, if any, has never been fully explored. Perhaps Cyrus Vance, who is the Manhattan District Attorney, who is going to get those records in relatively soon, I think. We'll learn more about that. But people always talk about, oh, well, of course Trump did this, and of course Trump was money laundering, and of course Trump is cheating on his taxes. Maybe yes, maybe no. I haven't seen proof of that. And I try to dwell in the world of proof.
It's a known world.
Not a prosecutor anymore, but even as a journalist, I think it's irresponsible to speculate about criminal behavior if you don't have evidence.
Well, this has been great. I have pages of other questions, but I'm going to give the microphone back to Andrea. And thank you, Jeff, for being so generous in your responses and with your time.
Well, this was so fun. And I'm not flogging, really. I just want to say you brought up so many great things, Scott. I can't decide which is my favorite part. The thing about Mueller losing his phone, it created such tension at the very beginning of the book. It was almost like a horror movie, like him leaving it. Anyway, I'll leave that to you people to discover the story behind. The Roger Stone stuff is just, perfect. It's so exciting and silly. The Nancy Pelosi descriptions, I love. If I didn't love her before, which I did, but I love her more now. And the explanations from the legal scholars about what impeachment requires. And that was so completely educational for me, and because I'm not a lawyer, and I loved it. It was clarifying and again, so entertaining. I mean, who would think that I could get so much enjoyment out of a book called
I
The
hope
Investigation?
too surprised.
It's a great,
I mean,
it is a great book. And Jeff was blessed with characters like Comey, who I never got to, or Rod Rosenstein, of really Shakespearean complexity. And he does them justice. And it is just a wonderful read.
yeah, I mean, you layer each of these players with such depth. I mean, the Adam Schiff descriptions are really, really fun. So, I mean, all of them are, you know, the good guys and the others, and the more complex guys, as you call them. So, thank you so much, Chevaliers. Go to writersblockpresents.com to get your link to Chevalier's books, because Jeff signed a whole bunch of copies and they're sitting at Chevalier's waiting. So, thanks, and see you soon at our next one.